The fluorescent light above the bathroom mirror flickered and buzzed like a dying insect. Megan Lawson leaned close to the glass, tilting her chin to the left, studying the damage. The bruise ran from just below her cheekbone to the corner of her jaw, a sprawling canvas of purple and sickly yellow that no amount of drugstore concealer could fully hide. She pressed the pad of her thumb against the swollen edge and winced a sharp hiss escaping through her teeth. The pain was familiar now. Not welcome, never welcome, but familiar the way a person learns to live with a broken step on their front porch. You just know to avoid it. She dabbed foundation over the bruise with practiced efficiency, blending the edges until the discoloration faded to something that could pass for a shadow in bad lighting. She had exactly 14 minutes to get to the Starlight Motel for her 6 o'clock shift, and June Hargrove, the motel manager, did not tolerate tardiness any more than she tolerated excuses about personal problems. In Kingman, Arizona, a woman with a 7-year-old daughter and no high school diploma did not have the luxury of calling in sick. Megan pulled her hair into a tight ponytail, the fluorescent light catching the streaks of premature gray threading through her blonde hair. She was 29 years old, but the face staring back at her from the mirror belonged to a woman a decade older. The lines around her mouth were not the kind earned by laughter. They were the deep grooves cut by clenched jaws and bitten tongues by years of swallowing screams so the neighbors would not hear. She turned off the bathroom light and walked down the narrow hallway of the trailer. The carpet was threadbare, stained in places she had stopped trying to identify. The walls were thin enough to hear the highway traffic, a constant low roar that had become the white noise of their existence. At the end of the hallway, the door to Grace's bedroom was cracked open. Megan paused, leaning her shoulder against the door frame, and looked inside. Grace was asleep, 7 years old, small for her age, with a tangle of blonde hair spread across a pillowcase decorated with cartoon horses. She was curled on her side, her knees pulled up to her chest, one arm wrapped around a stuffed bear that was missing a button eye. Even in sleep, the child's posture was defensive, protective, a tiny body braced against the world. On the nightstand beside her bed sat a ceramic piggy bank, pale pink, with a painted smile that was chipped at the mouth. Megan noticed the coin slot was empty. The bank was light. She had heard Grace shaking it a few days ago, counting the dull clinks of pennies and nickels against the ceramic walls, but had not thought much of it. Megan leaned in and pressed her lips gently against Grace's forehead, careful not to wake her. The child smelled like cheap strawberry shampoo and dust. For a moment, just a brief and precious moment, the world shrank to the size of that small bedroom, and nothing outside those thin walls existed. No badge, no fists, no whiskey-soaked voice in the dark. Then the moment passed and Megan straightened up, pulled on her sneakers, and walked out the front door of Lot 44 at the Suncrest Trailer Park. The Arizona heat was already brutal at 5:45 in the morning, the kind of heat that sat on your chest like a living thing. She locked the flimsy aluminum door behind her, knowing the lock would not stop anyone who truly wanted to get in, and walked the quarter-mile to the Starlight Motel along the dirt shoulder of the highway. There had been a time before all of this when Megan Lawson had been a different woman. Not wealthy, not educated, not blessed with any particular advantage, but whole. Her husband, Danny Lawson, had been a pipeline welder who worked 60-hour weeks and came home smelling like acetylene and sweat. He was not a complicated man. He loved his daughter, loved his wife, and loved cold beer on Friday nights while watching reruns of old westerns. He died on a Tuesday morning when a section of pipe shifted on a rigging crane and crushed his chest. Grace was 3 years old. She would never clearly remember her father's face, only the vague warmth of being held by large calloused hands. After Danny's death, Megan had held things together with the fierce, desperate grip of a woman who had no other option. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned motel rooms during the day, and waited tables at a barbecue joint on the highway at night. She kept Grace fed, kept the rent paid on the trailer, kept moving forward with the blind momentum of someone who could not afford to stop. Then Deputy Wade Prescott walked into the barbecue restaurant one Thursday evening. He was tall, broad-shouldered with a buzz cut, in a jawline that looked like it had been carved from desert stone. He wore his tan uniform like armor, and his badge gleamed under the cheap overhead lights. He was polite. He was charming. He tipped well and called her ma'am. He told her she had a beautiful smile and that a woman like her should not be working so hard. He offered to fix the leaky faucet in her trailer, and when he did, he brought a stuffed bear for Grace. It started slowly. It always starts slowly. The charm turned to possessiveness. The possessiveness turned to control. The control turned to violence. The first time he hit her was an open-handed slap across the kitchen over a dinner plate that was still warm in the center instead of hot. He apologized immediately, tears in his eyes, his hands gentle where they had been violent seconds before. He bought flowers. He promised it would never happen again. And Megan, conditioned by grief and exhaustion and the terrible human need to believe that the people who say they love you mean it, believed him. It happened again 3 weeks later, and then again. The apologies became shorter. The flowers stopped coming. The violence escalated in increments so small that each one seemed manageable in isolation. But together they formed a pattern as clear and inescapable as the bars of a cage. A slap became a shove. A shove became a punch. A punch became a boot in the ribs while she curled on the kitchen floor with her hands over her head, trying to make herself small enough to disappear. By the time Megan recognized the pattern, she was already trapped. Prescott had moved his things into the trailer without asking. He monitored her phone. He told her which shifts she could work and which she could not. He told her that if she ever tried to leave, he would arrest her for drug possession, plant the evidence himself, and make sure Grace ended up in a group home where no one would ever love her. And Megan believed him because in Kingman, Arizona, Deputy Wade Prescott was the law. The sheriff was his friend. The judge played poker at his house. The entire system was a cage with his name on every bar. 240 miles away on a cracked and blistering stretch of Interstate 40, cutting through the Nevada desert, the thundering roar of two Harley-Davidson engines split the morning silence like a declaration of war. Dean Gallagher rode point his custom Road King, eating the miles with a steady, relentless hunger. The wind pulled at his graying beard and hammered against his chest, pressing the heavy leather vest tight against his body. The three-piece patch on his back, the winged skull, the Texas bottom rocker, the MC Diamond announced to the world exactly who he was and dared anyone to have a problem with it. Behind him, offset by half a bike length to the right, Arthur Rooney, known to every member of the club and every law enforcement agency in 3 states, simply as Bull piloted his blacked-out street glide with the effortless ease of a man who had spent more of his adult life on 2 wheels than on 2 feet. Bull was enormous, a 6'4" wall of dense muscle and faded tattoos whose neck was wider than most men's thighs. A fresh scar ran across his jaw from a disagreement in Reno that had ended with a bar stool and a broken bottle. He had not started that fight, but he had finished it with a thoroughness that ensured the other party would eat through a straw for 6 weeks. They had been on the road for 2 days, returning from a charter meeting in Henderson that had run long and ended badly. Club politics were getting complicated. Territory disputes with a rival crew out of Tucson, pressure from the feds, and the constant exhausting work of keeping 100 men aligned under a single banner. Dean was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was a bone-deep weariness, the kind that settled into the marrow. After 2 decades of living on the edge of legality, one wrong decision away from a prison cell or a shallow grave. As the Arizona state line passed beneath their tires, the landscape transformed from the barren moonscape of Nevada into the brutal, sun-hammered expanse of Mojave County. The temperature gauge on Dean's bike read 112 degrees. The air shimmered above the blacktop, turning the distant mountains into wavering ghosts. Dean felt the heat through his leather boots, rising from the engine between his legs, cooking him slowly from the ground up. They needed fuel, food, and shade in that order. Kingman appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a scattering of low buildings and gas station signs huddled along the interstate. Dean signaled with a gloved hand, and they took the exit, the sudden drop in speed making the heat even more oppressive without the wind to cut through it. They fueled up at a Chevron station where the attendant watched them through the bulletproof glass with wide, unblinking eyes. Then they rolled 2 blocks down the main street to a place called Ruby's Desert Spoon, a diner that looked like it had not been renovated since Reagan was in office. The parking lot was half full of pickup trucks and a single 18-wheeler idling in the shade. Dean killed the engine. The sudden silence after hours of thundering exhaust was almost disorienting. He could hear the ticking of hot metal cooling the distant whine of a semi's refrigeration unit and the faint tinny sound of country music leaking through the diner's propped open back door. Bull swung his leg over his bike with a grunt, stretching his massive frame, his joints popping like gunfire. They pushed through the glass doors of Ruby's Desert Spoon, and the world inside went still. The low hum of conversation, the clink of silverware, the shuffle of the waitress's sneakers on the linoleum. All of it stopped the moment the 2 men stepped across the threshold. It was a reaction Dean had experienced 1,000 times. The immediate visceral recognition, the patches, the leather, the sheer physical presence that sucked the air out of a room like a pressure change. A trucker in the corner booth suddenly became intensely interested in his meatloaf. A young couple near the window exchanged a look of barely concealed panic. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with a name tag that read, Brenda gripped the coffee pot handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dean scanned the room out of habit. Exits, sightlines, threats. He found nothing but civilians. He jerked his chin toward the darkest booth in the back corner, the one farthest from the windows, and they walked to it without waiting to be seated. The leather of their vests creaked as they slid into the cracked vinyl seats. Bull grabbed a laminated menu and began scanning it with the focused intensity of a man who had not eaten in 12 hours. Dean stared out the dusty window at the highway, his mind wandering to a place it went more often than he cared to admit. 2 days ago at a post office in Henderson, he had mailed a child support check to an address in North Dallas. $1,200, the same amount he sent every month, like clockwork, to an ex-wife named Rachel, who had every right to hate him, and a daughter named Chloe, who probably did not remember his face. The check is his penance, his monthly admission of guilt, a financial apology for choosing the road over the nursery. Chloe was 12 now. The last time he had seen her, she was 7, the same age as the years he had missed. Bull was halfway through ordering a steak eggs, a short stack of pancakes, and a side of biscuits and gravy when the floorboards near their booth creaked. Dean turned his head slowly, his body tensing on instinct. He expected a drunk local with something to prove, or a teenager on a dare, or perhaps the manager asking them to leave. What he saw instead stopped him cold. A little girl stood at the edge of their table. She was small, alarmingly thin, with blonde hair that hung in limp, unwashed strands around a sharp, pale face. She wore a yellow sundress that was at least 2 sizes too big, the shoulder straps threatening to slide off her narrow frame, the hem dragging against the floor. The dress had been washed so many times the original bright yellow had faded to something closer to the color of old parchment. Her sneakers were worn through at the toes and her fingernails were bitten down to the quick. But it was her eyes that hit Dean like a fist to the sternum. They were an icy, piercing blue, enormous, in her small face, and they held absolutely no trace of the fear that was currently paralyzing every adult in the room. This child was not afraid of them. In that moment, Dean Gallagher understood that this little girl had already met something far more terrifying than 2 outlaw bikers. Bull paused mid-order, his massive hand dwarfing the coffee mug he had just lifted to his lips. He looked at the girl, then at Dean, then back at the girl. "You lost, sweetheart?" Bull asked, making an effort to soften his voice, though the result still sounded like gravel being poured into a steel drum. The girl did not flinch. She took a single, deliberate step closer to the table and reached into the pocket of her oversized dress. Her small fist was clenched tight around something, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Slowly, with the gravity of a person performing a sacred ritual, she opened her fingers and placed a crumpled piece of paper on the table between Dean's water glass and the salt shaker. It was a $10 bill. It was damp with the sweat of a child's hand slightly torn at one corner and had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had become soft furrows in the paper. Dean stared at it. He could see faint traces of dirt on the bill, the kind that comes from being buried in a yard or hidden under a mattress. "What's this little bird?" Dean asked, his voice dropping to a register he did not normally use. His forearms rested on the table and he leaned forward slightly, bringing himself closer to her eye level. "It's everything I have," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, thin and tremulous, but every word landed with a clarity that cut through the hum of the air conditioner and the distant clatter of the kitchen. "I broke my piggy bank. It took me a long time to save it up from finding cans." Bull set his coffee down gently. The amusement on his face was already giving way to something more cautious, more alert. "That's real kind of you, darling, but we don't need charity. Go on and buy yourself some ice cream." "I don't want ice cream." The girl's gaze shifted from Bull to Dean, and her eyes locked on to his with an intensity that belonged to someone decades older. "I heard the man at the gas station tell his friend that you were outlaws, that you do bad things to people." The silence in the diner was absolute. Brenda, the waitress, stood behind the counter with a dish towel pressed to her chest, barely breathing. The trucker in the corner had abandoned all pretense of eating and was staring openly. Dean did not smile. He looked at the $10 bill, then back at the girl. "People say a lot of things, kid. What's your name?" "Grace." "All right, Grace, I'm Dean. This mountain over here is Bull. Now tell me why you're giving us your life savings." Grace took a breath that shuddered through her entire small body. Her bottom lip trembled, and she bit down on it hard the way a person does when they are physically fighting the act of crying. She won the battle. The tears stayed where they were. "I need you to hurt someone for me. I need you to make the monster go away." The words hung in the stale air of the diner like smoke. Bull slowly placed both of his massive palms flat on the table, the playfulness completely gone from his weathered face. He looked at Dean. Dean looked at the girl. "Where are your parents, Grace?" Dean asked, his voice careful, measured. "My dad is in heaven. My mom works at the motel down the road, the Starlight." "And who is this monster?" Grace reached up to twist a strand of her blonde hair around her finger. It was a nervous gesture, reflexive, and as she raised her arm, the oversized sleeve of the yellow sundress slid down past her elbow. Dean's breath caught in his chest and held there, trapped behind a sudden wall of cold fury. Around the child's thin wrist, clearly visible against her pale skin, were dark bruises. They were not the random marks of a clumsy child who had fallen off a bike or bumped into a doorframe. They were finger-shaped 4 parallel lines of deep purple pressed into the flesh by the grip of an adult hand with a matching thumbprint bruise on the inside of the wrist. Someone had grabbed this child hard enough to leave the full imprint of their hand on her body. Bull saw them at the same moment. The big man went completely still. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck cording like steel cables, and his eyes went flat and dark in a way that Dean had seen only in moments that preceded extreme violence. "Who did that to you, Grace?" Dean asked. His voice had dropped an octave, stripped of warmth, leaving only a cold, precise quietness that was far more dangerous than shouting. Grace yanked her sleeve back down, shame flooding her small face, as though the bruises were her fault. "He didn't mean to do this part. He grabbed me because I was trying to stand between him and my mom. He hurts her all the time. He makes her cry so loud she has to put a pillow over her face so the neighbors won't call the police." "Why doesn't your mom call the police?" Bull asked, his voice a low rumble. And then Grace laughed. It was a short, bitter, cynical sound that had no business coming from a 7-year-old girl. It was a laugh of a person who had already learned that the systems designed to protect them were the very systems holding the cage door shut. "Because he is the police," Grace whispered, leaning closer over the table as if sharing a terrible secret. "His name is Wade. Everyone calls him Deputy Prescott. He drives the white car with the sirens. He told my mom that if she tries to leave, he'll put drugs in our house and tell the judge she's a bad mom. And they'll take me away and put me somewhere where nobody will ever love me. She pushed the crumpled $10 bill a fraction of an inch closer to Dean. Please, I watched you ride in from the window. You look scarier than he does. Is $10 enough to make him leave us alone? He told my mom tonight he's taking us for a ride to the desert. The last sentence landed like a grenade dropped on the table. Tonight, not someday, not eventually. Tonight. This was not a chronic situation waiting for a gradual resolution. This was a countdown. Dean looked at Bull. Bull looked at Dean. Decades of brotherhood of shared roads and shared violence allowed them to communicate entire conversations in a single glance. Bull's eyes said, "This is a badge. We cannot touch this. We will not make it out of the county." Dean heard every word. He also heard the echo of something else, the voice of a 12-year-old girl in Dallas asking her mother why her father never came home. Dean reached across the table and picked up the crumpled $10 bill. Grace's eyes ignited with a desperate, trembling hope, a light so intense and fragile that Dean felt physically afraid of extinguishing it. "Grace," Dean said gently, "keep your money." He pressed the bill back into her small hand and closed her fingers around it. The light in her eyes died. It did not fade gradually. It was extinguished instantly and completely, like a candle snuffed by a fist. She nodded once, a small, tired nod that carried the weight of a lifetime of disappointment compressed into 7 years. She turned to walk away. "Hold on," Dean said. Grace stopped. She looked back over her shoulder, and Dean saw it, the faintest, most fragile spark, still alive in those icy blue eyes. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. The refusal to stop hoping, even after hope had proven itself useless 100 times before. Dean slid out of the booth. He dropped a 20 on the table. "Brenda," he called to the waitress who flinched at the sound of her name. "Wrap the steaks in foil. We're taking everything to go." Bull exhaled heavily, a sound that seemed to deflate his entire massive torso. "Dean, tell me we're not doing what I think we're doing. We're just giving her a ride to the motel, making sure she gets back to her mom safe." "And then what?" Dean did not answer. He did not need to. The rigid set of his jaw, the cold light in his eyes, the way his hand had instinctively moved to the heavy Bowie knife sheath at his hip, all of it told Bull exactly what was going to happen. "Go out the side door, Grace," Dean instructed, keeping his voice low. "Wait by the dumpsters in the alley. Don't let anyone see you walking out front with us." The girl slipped away like a ghost, moving through the diner with the practiced stealth of a child who had learned to make herself invisible. Bull stood, his massive frame rising from the booth like a small earthquake. He took the foil-wrapped food from Brenda's trembling hands. "You realize what we're walking into," Bull muttered as they moved toward the front door. "A dirty cop in a small town." "That's not a fight, Dean. That's a trap." "We're already in the club, brother," Dean replied, pushing the glass door open into the blinding Arizona sun. "We've been in the trap our whole lives. At least this time it's for a reason." The ride to Suncrest Trailer Park took less than 5 minutes. The transition from the highway to the trailer park was like crossing a border between the visible world and the forgotten one. The park sat in a shallow depression off the main road, hidden from the eyes of passing tourists behind a row of dead skeletal Joshua trees. It was a graveyard of rusted metal, sun-warped plastic, and dirt so dry it looked like the surface of another planet. Broken toys lay scattered in yards that had never known grass. Satellite dishes tilted at drunken angles on rooftops. The air smelled of hot metal and propane and something faintly chemical that Dean did not want to identify. They coasted in with their engines throttled low, but there was no disguising the deep, barrel-chested rumble of 2 straight-piped Harleys. Curtains twitched in trailer windows. A dog barked somewhere and was quickly silenced. Dean could feel the eyes on them, dozens of them watching from behind thin walls in dirty glass, measuring the threat. In a place like this, strangers always meant trouble. They parked behind a rusted-out Ford Bronco near Lot 44. The trailer was a single wide, maybe 40 feet long, streaked with rust and desert grime. The skirting along the bottom was kicked in along one side, exposing the dark crawl space beneath. A front window had been broken and patched with silver duct tape that had bubbled and peeled in the heat. A battered Honda Civic sat in the dirt patch that served as a driveway. Grace appeared from the scrub brush at the edge of the lot, having run the back way through the weeds and drainage ditches. She was breathing hard, her yellow dress streaked with dust. "My mom's car is here," she whispered, pointing at the Honda. "She got off work early." Her eyes scanned the lot with the quick, practiced vigilance of a combat veteran. "His car isn't here." "Not yet." Dean nodded. "All right, let's go talk to your mom." He walked toward the trailer's front door and stopped. The metal door frame was splintered, the cheap aluminum door hanging slightly ajar on bent hinges. The damage was fresh. Splinters of fake wood paneling littered the cinder block step. Someone had kicked this door in recently within the last hour. Dean threw out his arms, stopping Grace and Bull in their tracks. His right hand moved to the Bowie knife at his hip. He pressed 2 fingers to his lips, signaling silence, and gently pushed the door open with the toe of his boot. It swung inward with a painful screech of twisted metal. The smell hit him first. Stale cigarettes, cheap lavender air freshener, the copper tang of blood, and beneath all of it, the sour reek of fear. The living room of the trailer was destroyed. A particle board coffee table lay overturned, its surface cracked. Shattered glass from a broken drinking glass glittered on the worn carpet. The television, a small flat screen that had probably been the most expensive thing in the home, was face down on the floor, its screen shattered. And in the corner of the tiny kitchen, pressed into the narrow gap between the refrigerator and the laminate cabinets, sat Megan Lawson. She was holding a bloody dish towel against her forehead. Her lower lip was split, and the left side of her face was swollen and discolored, the eye nearly shut. She was shaking a fine, constant tremor that ran through her entire body like an electrical current. When 2 massive, leather-clad men stepped through the shattered doorway of her home, she did not scream. She did not scramble for a weapon or a cry for help. She simply pressed herself harder into the corner and stared at them with the flat, resigned eyes of a woman who had run out of capacity for surprise. Whatever came next, her eyes said she would endure it. She always endured it. "Mom!" Grace pushed past Bull's legs and ran into the kitchen, throwing her small arms around her mother's neck. Megan flinched at the contact, a reflexive response that broke Dean's heart, and then her arms wrapped around her daughter with a fierce, trembling desperation. "Grace, baby, what are you doing? Who are these men? Where did you go?" Megan's voice was raw, torn a whisper, fighting to become a cry. Dean stepped forward slowly, keeping his hands visible, palms up. "Ma'am, my name is Dean. This is Bull. Your daughter came to find us at the diner. She offered us $10 to deal with a problem." Megan closed her eyes and tears tracked through the drying blood on her cheek. "Oh, Grace, no. No, baby, you shouldn't have done that. You don't know what you've brought down on us." She looked up at Dean, and the panic in her eyes was genuine, primal, the fear of a woman who knew exactly how the next few hours were going to unfold. "You need to leave, right now. If he comes back and finds you here, you don't know what he is. He runs this town. He'll kill you both, and then he'll finish what he started with me." "Deputy Wade Prescott," Dean said. It was not a question. Megan nodded a short, frantic movement. "He did this to you today." Dean continued, his eyes cataloging the damage. The split lip was recent. The forehead gash was still bleeding. The swelling around her eye was fresh, maybe an hour old. "And your daughter says he's planning to take you both for a ride tonight, to the desert." Megan's face crumbled. The last wall of composure she had been holding together dissolved, and she let out a sound that was not quite a chee and not quite a scream, a broken animal sound of helplessness. He said he was going to the station to get his backup piece. He said when he comes back, we're going for a drive and we're going to settle things once and for all. I know what that means. Everyone in this town knows what that means. Bull shifted his weight in the doorway, his massive frame blotting out the sunlight. His face was a granite mask, but Dean could see the big man's hands opening and closing at his sides, the tendons in his forearms tight as bowstrings. He's not just a cop, Megan continued, the words pouring out now with the frantic urgency of a person who had been silent too long. He handles the money. The drugs come up through the desert from a man named Salinas, and Wade holds the cash until it gets laundered through the auto body shops and the used car lots. The sheriff knows. Sheriff Buford takes a cut. Half the county is in on it. Wade keeps a ledger, a notebook with everything in it, every name, every date, every dollar. He keeps it here in this trailer because nobody would ever think to search the home of the woman he beats. Dean absorbed this information with the cold, calculating efficiency of a man who had spent decades navigating criminal ecosystems. The picture was worse than he had expected. This was not a simple domestic abuse case. It was a cartel operation running through a corrupt county government, and the woman sitting in the blood on this kitchen floor was both the hostage and the hiding place. He keeps something else too, Megan whispered, glancing at Grace, who had buried her face in her mother's chest. He has a camera hidden in the smoke detector in the living room. He records everything that happens here, every meeting, every time someone picks up or drops off money. He told me it's his insurance. If anyone ever tries to cross him, he has video of them taking cartel money. Dean looked at Bull. Bull looked at the smoke detector on the ceiling, a white plastic disc that looked identical to every other smoke detector in every other cheap trailer in America. Except this one had a pinhole lens barely visible at its edge. Where does he keep the recordings? Dean asked. A hard drive, under the bed in a metal box bolted to the frame. He thinks I don't know, but I hear him checking it at night when he thinks I'm asleep. Before Dean could respond, a sound cut through the stifling air of the trailer, the crunch of heavy tires on loose gravel. Then the sharp chirp of a police siren, a single aggressive burst meant not as a warning to traffic, but as an announcement of authority, of ownership. Bull turned to the cracked front window. Through the dirty glass and the silver duct tape, red and blue strobe lights painted the interior of the trailer in frantic, violent color. A white Ford Explorer with the Kingman County Sheriff's star emblazoned on the door had skidded to a stop directly behind their motorcycles, blocking them in. The engine idled, heavy and predatory. The light bar cycled through its colors with a mechanical indifference that felt like a countdown. "He's here," Megan breathed, pulling Grace against her body so tightly the child whimpered. "Oh God, he's here. He's early. He wasn't supposed to be back for another hour." Dean watched through the window as the driver's door of the Explorer swung open. A tall man stepped out broad through the shoulders, wearing a crisp tan uniform, darkened with sweat at the collar and under the arms. Deputy Wade Prescott. He was flushed, the high color of a man running on whiskey and adrenaline. He stood beside his vehicle for a moment, surveying the two Harley-Davidsons with a mixture of confusion and predatory interest, the way a dog examines an unfamiliar animal that has wandered into its yard. Then his right hand drifted to the holster on his hip, and his fingers unsnapped the retention strap. "Looks like the monster came home early," Dean said quietly. He unfastened the leather strap over his Bowie knife and turned to Megan. "Stay in the kitchen. Keep Grace down. Don't come out until I tell you." "He'll kill you," Megan said, her voice flat with certainty. "He's killed before, everyone knows it. Nobody can prove it." "He hasn't killed anyone like us," Bull said from the doorway, and there was no bravado in his voice, only a simple statement of mechanical fact, like a man observing that water is wet. Dean stepped out of the trailer, down the single cinder block step into the dirt yard. The sun hit him like a physical assault, the heat rising from the ground in visible waves. Bull followed his boots, landing heavy in the dust. They stood shoulder to shoulder, two men in scarred leather, facing a man in a pressed uniform with a gun on his hip and the arrogance of unchecked authority etched into every line of his face. Prescott stopped 10 feet away. He was bigger up close, pushing 240 pounds with a thick neck and small, hard eyes that held the cold intelligence of a predator. He looked at the patches on their vests, the winged skull, the Texas rocker, and a flicker of something crossed his face. Not quite fear, recognition. The understanding that the men standing in front of him were not the usual civilians he was accustomed to terrorizing. But the whiskey and the ego were stronger than his caution, and the flicker passed. Megan, he barked, his voice carrying across the trailer park with the practiced volume of a man used to shouting orders. Get out here, and whoever owns these chrome eyesores better start talking, because you've got about 30 seconds before I arrest you for trespassing and run your plates through the national database. Dean stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his weight balanced evenly on both feet. The lady inside invited us in, deputy. Way I see it, the only one trespassing on her peace is you. Prescott's face darkened. The veins in his neck pulsed visibly against his collar. You don't know who you're talking to, old man. This is my jurisdiction. This trailer, this park, that woman, they're all under my protection. Funny word, protection, Bull rumbled. The woman inside looks like she's been protected real hard. Split lip, black eye, blood on the kitchen floor. That the kind of protection the county offers. Prescott's hand tightened on the grip of his holstered Glock. The smug composure cracked just slightly, revealing something ugly and panic beneath. I don't know what she told you, but Megan Lawson is a known substance abuser with a history of erratic behavior. Any injury she has are self-inflicted. I'm here to conduct a welfare check. A welfare check, Dean repeated, his voice flat. With your backup piece, at the home of a woman you've been beating for the past 2 years, after you told her you were taking her for a ride to the desert tonight. The color drained from Prescott's face. His eyes darted to the trailer, then back to Dean. She's lying. She's a liar and a junkie, and you're making a very serious mistake believing a word she says. I didn't hear it from her, Dean said quietly. I heard it from your stepdaughter. The 7-year-old with your handprints bruised into her wrist. Something snapped in Prescott's eyes. The calculation, the political maneuvering, the careful language of a man used to operating behind the shield of his badge. It all fell away, and what remained was the raw, unmasked fury of a man whose control was slipping. He drew the Glock from his holster, leveling it at Dean's chest with both hands. On the ground, both of you, hands behind your heads, out in the world Dean and Bull inhabited. A drawn gun was not the end of a conversation. It was the beginning of one. Dean had looked down the barrel of a weapon more times than he could count, and the fear response that would have frozen a civilian, the heart-stopping paralysis that Prescott relied upon, simply did not exist in his nervous system. What replaced it was a cold, crystalline clarity, a sharpening of perception that slowed time and widened the field of vision. Dean noted the slight tremor in Prescott's hands. He noted the deputy's weight was shifted too far forward on his front foot, an aggressive stance that sacrificed balance. He noted the distance between them, roughly 8 feet close enough. Bull moved first, not toward the gun, to the side. His massive hand closed around the rusted metal lid of a trash can sitting near the trailer, skirting, and he hurled it horizontally with a speed and force that defied his enormous frame. The heavy disc of corroded metal spun through the air and struck Prescott's extended left arm with a sickening crack. The deputy screamed his stance, collapsing his first shot, punching wide and shattering the driver's side mirror of his own cruiser with a sound like a gunshot inside a cathedral. Dean closed the distance in 2 strides. He drove his boot into the outside of Prescott's knee with every pound of force he could generate, and the joint buckled sideways with a wet structural pop that echoed across the silent trailer park. Prescott went down, his scream cutting off into a choked gurgle, as Dean seized his right wrist, twisted it violently outward until the tendons screamed and stripped the Glock from his grip. The weapon tumbled into the dust. Bull's boot came down on it, instantly burying it in the dirt. Dean drove his elbow into the soft tissue beneath Prescott's jaw, not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to stun, to scramble the synapses, and turn the world into a ringing, tilting blur. Prescott hit the ground face first, his hands clawing weakly at the baked earth, his shattered knee bent at an angle that made even Bull wince. Dean knelt beside him, pressing his forearm against the back of the deputy's neck, pinning his face in the dirt. "You talk a lot about jurisdiction, Wade," Dean whispered, his mouth close to the deputy's ear. "But out here in the dust, the only law that matters is who gets up and who stays down." Bull reached down, grabbed Prescott by the back of his duty belt, and lifted the 240-pound man off the ground like a child picking up a rag doll. He carried the groaning, half-conscious deputy up the cinder block step and through the shattered door of the trailer. He dropped him onto the stained floral sofa in the center of the living room, where Prescott lay gasping, clutching his destroyed knee, the tan uniform darkened with dirt and sweat and the first bloom of blood seeping through the fabric. The swagger was gone. The badge was just a piece of metal pinned to a man who was crying. Megan and Grace were still in the kitchen. Grace peered around her mother's hip, her blue eyes enormous, fixed on the broken man on the sofa. "He fell down," Grace whispered, and there was wonder in her voice, the disbelief of a child witnessing something she had been told was impossible. "Mom, the monster fell down." Dean picked up a broken chair leg from the debris on the floor and pulled a bar stool up to the sofa, sitting directly in front of the whimpering deputy. Bull positioned himself at the door, arms crossed a human barricade. The trailer was silent except for Prescott's ragged, shallow breathing and the steady tick of a cheap clock on the wall. "All right, Wade," Dean said, tapping the wooden chair leg gently against his open palm. "Let's talk about the $10 I was paid to make you disappear. And let's talk about the bag you've got hidden in the air duct. And let's talk about the little camera in the smoke detector." The last vestige of color drained from Prescott's face. His eyes went wide, showing white all around the iris, the expression of a man who has just realized the ground beneath his feet is not ground at all, but the thin crust over an abyss. "How?" Prescott croaked. "How do you know about that? The woman you've been terrorizing for 2 years is a lot smarter than you gave her credit for," Dean replied. "Bull, the vent." Bull walked to the loose air conditioning vent near the hallway, kicked the flimsy grate aside, and reached down into the ductwork. His arm disappeared up to the elbow. When he withdrew it, he was holding a heavy black waterproof duffel bag. He tossed it onto the broken coffee table where it landed with a dense, significant thud. Dean unzipped the bag. Inside, arranged with meticulous care, were neat stacks of $100 bills, shrink-wrapped in plastic. Beneath the cash were 3 taped bricks of white powder, each stamped with a small scorpion symbol. And nestled beside the drugs in a Ziploc bag to protect it from moisture was a black moleskin notebook. Dean opened the notebook and paged through it. Dates, dollar amounts, badge numbers, drop locations, names. It was a complete operational ledger for a narcotics distribution network running through Kingman County. Sheriff Harold Buford's name appeared on nearly every page. Dean closed the notebook and looked at Prescott. "You're not just a cop who hits women, Wade. You're the bookkeeper for a cartel pipeline, and you've been stupid enough to keep the evidence in the home of the woman you abuse. You don't understand." Prescott whimpered, tears and snot running freely down his face. "That money belongs to Salinas. If it goes missing, he'll skin me alive. He'll come for Megan. He'll come for the kid." "Salinas is not your problem right now," Dean said, standing up. "I am." Dean looked at Megan, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, one hand on Grace's shoulder, watching the scene with an expression Dean could not quite read. It was not gratitude. Not yet. It was something more complex, the slow, terrified dawn of a possibility she had stopped believing in. The possibility that the cage door might actually open. "The hard drive," Dean said to her. "Under the bed. Can you get it?" Megan hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she squeezed Grace's shoulder, walked down the narrow hallway to the bedroom, and knelt beside the sagging mattress. Dean heard the scrape of metal, the click of a latch. She returned carrying a small gray metal box, the kind sold at office supply stores for fireproof document storage. She set it on the kitchen counter and opened the lid. Inside was a portable hard drive, black about the size of a paperback novel. Megan held it up. "Everything is on here," she said, and her voice had changed. The trembling was still there, but beneath it, like bedrock, beneath sand, was something harder. Something that had been buried for a very long time. Every meeting, every pickup, every time the sheriff walked through that door and counted money at my kitchen table while my daughter was sleeping 10 feet away. Dean took the hard drive and placed it in the duffel bag alongside the ledger. He zipped the bag closed and slung it over his shoulder. Then he walked out to Prescott's cruiser, reached through the broken window, and picked up the radio microphone. He keyed the transmitter. "Dispatch, this is a concerned citizen at Lot 44 Suncrest Trailer Park. You might want to tell Sheriff Buford to get down here in a hurry. His boy Prescott just had a real bad evening and his retirement fund is sitting on the coffee table. The sheriff has 10 minutes before I start making phone calls to people who are a lot less friendly than me." He tossed the microphone back onto the seat and walked back inside. He set the duffel bag on the counter and looked at Megan. "Now we wait," he said, "and when the sheriff gets here, you let me do the talking. After that, you and Grace are going to pack a bag and you're going to leave this place. Tonight, whatever happens with the law, with the cartel, with the sheriff, none of it touches you. Understand?" Megan looked at him, and for the first time, the fear in her eyes shared space with something else. A small, fierce flame that had been starved of oxygen for years, finally catching a breath of air. "I understand," she said. Grace tugged at her mother's hand. "Mom, oh," she said, her voice small but steady. "I told you they were scarier than the monster." The clock on the wall ticked 9 minutes. The trailer sat in silence, the heat pressing down like a judgment. Outside, the Arizona sun continued its merciless descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and amber. And somewhere on the highway, growing closer with every second, the sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of a sheriff who was about to discover that the comfortable world he had built on corruption and cruelty was already burning to the ground. Sheriff Harold Buford arrived in exactly 9 minutes. His black unmarked Chevy Tahoe tore into the trailer park at a speed that sent gravel spraying against the sides of neighboring trailers, and he brought 2 deputies with him. Both young, both armed, both visibly confused about why they had been pulled from their evening patrol to respond to a vague dispatch call about a disturbance at Suncrest. Buford stepped out of the Tahoe, and Dean studied him through the cracked window. The sheriff was in his early 60s, heavy-set with a jowled face and a silver Stetson hat that he adjusted nervously as he surveyed the scene. His eyes moved from Prescott's bullet-damaged cruiser to the 2 Harley-Davidsons, to the shattered front door of the trailer, and the blood drained from his fleshy face in stages like water leaving a bathtub. Buford approached the door. Bull filled the entire frame, his arms crossed over his massive chest, blocking entry. The sheriff stopped, looked up at the enormous biker, and swallowed hard enough for Dean to hear the click from inside the trailer. "I'm Sheriff Buford," he said, his voice tight, straining to maintain authority. "I received a call over dispatch about a disturbance." "Come on in, Sheriff," Dean called from the shadows of the kitchen. "Your boy had a rough afternoon." Bull stepped aside just enough to let Buford squeeze through. The sheriff entered the cramped, destroyed living room and stopped dead when he saw Prescott. The deputy was curled on the stained sofa, clutching his grotesquely swollen knee, his face a mask of sweat and terror. His uniform was torn and filthy, and the holster on his hip was empty. Buford's eyes moved from Prescott to Dean, who stepped into the light holding the black moleskin ledger. Dean tossed it underhand, and the sheriff caught it against his chest with fumbling hands. He opened it. Dean watched the man's face as his eyes scanned the pages, watched the recognition bloom like a bruise, watched the precise moment when Buford saw his own initials and badge number recorded next to five-digit dollar amounts. "You have a significant problem, Sheriff," Dean said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who held every card at the table. "Your deputy here got careless. He's been using his girlfriend's trailer as a stash house for cartel money and product, and he's been keeping a detailed ledger of every transaction, every participant, including you. Your name is on page 4, page 11, page 19, and about a dozen more." Buford looked at the ledger, then at the black duffel bag sitting on the counter, then at Prescott. The sheriff's mind was visibly churning behind his small, calculating eyes, running the numbers, measuring the escape routes, weighing the cost of every possible decision. "What do you want?" Buford asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Arrest him," Dean said, pointing at Prescott. "Right now, in front of your deputies. Assault, battery, domestic violence, whatever charges stick. Get him into a cell and keep him there. And the bag stays right where it is, evidence." "And the woman," Buford asked, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. "She's a witness. She's seen the ledger. She knows the name. The woman is not your concern." Dean replied, his voice hardening. "The woman and her daughter are under my protection. If anything happens to them, anything at all, if she trips on a curb or gets a parking ticket or wakes up with a cold, I will hold you personally responsible. And I won't come back with lawyers, Sheriff. I'll come back with brothers." Buford held Dean's stare for 3 seconds, then looked away. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but in the language of men who live by dominance and submission, it was a total surrender. The sheriff of Kingman County had just been stared down in a trailer park by a man who did not recognize his authority, and they both knew it. "Harold, don't do this," Prescott wheezed from the sofa, using the sheriff's first name with a desperate familiarity. "You can't let them dictate terms. They assaulted a sworn officer. We can turn this around." "Shut up, Wade," Buford snapped, and the venom in his voice was not directed at the bikers, but at the man who had created this catastrophe. The sheriff looked at Dean for a long measuring moment, then turned to the doorway. "Deputy Simmons, Deputy Hale, get in here and cuff Prescott. Read him his rights." The two young deputies looked at each other in confusion, then at their sheriff, then at the massive biker blocking the door. Simmons was the first to move, unclipping his handcuffs and approaching the sofa with the cautious steps of a man walking towards something he did not fully understand. "Harold, you're making a mistake," Prescott said, his voice rising in pitch as the reality crystallized. "Salinas will burn this whole county down. You know that. You burned it down, Wade," Buford replied, already turning away, "when you decided to keep your insurance policy in the same place you kept your punching bag." They hauled Prescott off the sofa, and the deputy screamed as his destroyed knee buckled under him. They dragged him through the door, down the cinder block step, across the dirt, and into the back of a cruiser. His Miranda rights were read over his screams, the familiar words sounding hollow and mechanical against the soundtrack of a man's life collapsing. Dean watched from the doorway until the cruiser doors slammed shut. Then he turned back to Buford, who was standing in the middle of the wrecked living room, still holding the ledger, staring at the duffel bag with the hungry, desperate eyes of a drowning man looking at a lifeboat. "Don't even think about it," Dean said quietly. "The money stays. The ledger stays. That bag is going to be exactly where it is when the right people come to collect it." "And who would those right people be?" Buford asked, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. The initial shock was fading, and the survival instinct of a career criminal was beginning to assert itself. "That's up to you, Sheriff. You can call the feds yourself, get ahead of this, and maybe negotiate something that doesn't end with you dying in a federal prison. Or you can try to make this disappear, and I make a phone call to 50 men in Texas who will ride down that highway and dismantle everything you've built, badge by badge, bone by bone." Buford stared at Dean. The threat was not theatrical. It was delivered with the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a weather report, and that was what made it terrifying. Dean was not posturing. He was describing a sequence of events as inevitable as sunrise. "Fine," Buford said, though the words sounded like it was being pulled from his throat with pliers. He turned and walked out of the trailer without looking back. The Stetson pulled low over his eyes, the ledger clutched against his chest like a shield. Dean watched the Tahoe pull away its taillights, shrinking into the gathering dusk. He turned to Bull. "He's not going to call the feds." "No," Bull agreed, his voice flat. "He's going to call his people and try to clean this up. Which means he's going to send someone back here for the bag, and for her." Dean nodded toward the kitchen where Megan was holding Grace, both of them frozen in the aftermath of violence. Bull looked at Dean with an expression that mixed exasperation with a grudging, bone-deep loyalty. "So we're staying." "We're staying." Dean pulled the burner phone from the inside pocket of his leather vest. He dialed a number from memory, a number that connected to a prepaid cell sitting in a drawer at the Phoenix chapter's clubhouse, a line reserved for emergencies. "It's Iron," Dean said when the line picked up. "I'm in Kingman, Suncrest Trailer Park Lot 44. I've got a situation with a dirty sheriff and cartel money. I need bodies." The voice on the other end was low, careful. "How many?" "As many as you can spare. We're looking at a possible cleanup crew coming in tonight. Local law enforcement is compromised." A pause, then, "I can have 4 brothers there in 3 hours, maybe 5. That fast enough?" "It'll have to be." Dean hung up and turned to Megan. "You need to pack. Whatever you can carry in 20 minutes. Just the essentials. Clothes for you and Grace, documents, anything irreplaceable. We're moving you out of this trailer tonight. But first, we need to make sure no one else comes through that door." Megan stood in the kitchen doorway. Grace pressed against her side, and for a moment she did not move. She was looking at Dean with an expression that Dean recognized because he had seen it before on the faces of people who had been in captivity so long they no longer trusted open doors. Freedom, when it comes suddenly, can feel more dangerous than the cage. "Why are you doing this?" Megan asked, her voice barely audible. "You don't know us. You're risking everything for people you met an hour ago." Dean looked at Grace, the little girl in the faded yellow dress, clutching her stuffed bear, watching him with those enormous blue eyes that had somehow found the courage to walk up to 2 strangers and ask for the impossible. "Because she asked," Dean said simply, "and because the last time a little girl needed me, I wasn't there." Megan held his gaze for a moment, something shifting behind her bruised, exhausted eyes. Then she nodded, took Grace by the hand, and disappeared down the narrow hallway to the bedroom. Dean heard drawers opening, the rustle of clothes being shoved into bags, the quiet, urgent murmur of a mother telling her daughter to choose one toy, just one, whatever she loved the most. Bull had already begun fortifying their position with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who had defended contested ground before. He dragged the heavy bar stool against the front door as a rudimentary alarm. He checked the windows, noting which ones opened and which were sealed by paint and age. He found Prescott's personal shotgun, a Remington 8.7-0, racked in a closet near the bathroom, loaded with 5 rounds of double-aught buckshot. "Prescott's piece," Bull said, holding up the shotgun. "Loaded. You want it?" "Give it to her?" Dean said, nodding toward the hallway. Bull raised an eyebrow. "The woman? She's lived with a violent man for 2 years. She knows how to handle a gun. She just never had one pointed in the right direction." When Megan returned to the living room carrying a battered suitcase and a backpack stuffed with Grace's clothes, Dean gestured to the shotgun resting on the kitchen counter. "Do you know how to use that?" Megan looked at the weapon and something flickered across her face. Not fear, not hesitation, recognition. "My husband taught me to shoot before he died. Danny said every woman living alone should know how to defend her home. Then it's yours tonight. If anyone comes through a door or a window that isn't me or Bull, you put them down. Don't aim for the legs. Don't fire a warning shot. Center mass. Can you do that?" Megan picked up the shotgun. She checked the chamber, checked the safety, and seated the stock against her shoulder, with a familiarity that surprised even Bull. Her hands were still shaking, but her grip was correct, and her eyes, when she raised them to meet Dean's, held a new quality. Something forged in the fire of the last hour hammered into shape by the sight of her abuser crying on her living room floor. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." Dean nodded. "Good. Grace, come here." The little girl approached cautiously, still clutching her one-eyed bear. Dean knelt down to her level the way he had at the diner, the way he had not done with his own daughter in 5 years. "Listen to me, little bird. Things might get noisy tonight. If anything happens, you go straight to the bedroom closet, you close the door, you put your bear over your ears, and you don't come out until your mom or I come to get you. Can you do that for me?" Grace nodded solemnly. Then she reached into the pocket of her yellow dress and pulled out the crumpled $10 bill. She held it out to Dean. "You didn't take your money yet," she said, "for the job." Despite everything, despite the destroyed trailer and the blood on the floor and the corrupt sheriff circling like a vulture and the cartel money sitting on the counter like a ticking bomb, Dean felt the corner of his mouth twitch into something that was almost a smile. "Tell you what," he said gently, pushing her hand back. "You hold on to that for me. I'll collect when the job is really done." While they waited, Dean sat at the kitchen table and examined the ledger more carefully. The handwriting was precise, almost obsessive, each entry recorded in Prescott's neat block letters. It told the story of a network that had been operating for at least 3 years. Money came up from Sonora, through a series of couriers, was held briefly in Kingman, then dispersed through a web of legitimate businesses, auto body shops, used car lots, a laundromat on the east side of town. The amounts were staggering. Over the past 12 months alone, the ledger documented nearly $2 million in transactions. Buford's cut was consistent 8%, deposited in a personal account at a bank in Flagstaff under his wife's maiden name. Dean committed the key details to memory, names, locations, the rhythm of the operation, not because he planned to use the information himself, but because knowledge was leverage, and leverage was the only currency that kept men like Buford honest. Bull, meanwhile, had found a can of peaches in the kitchen pantry and was eating them with his fingers, the heavy syrup dripping down his wrist. He offered the can to Grace, who took a single peach slice and ate it carefully, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her mother, the stuffed bear in her lap. "What's the bear's name?" Bull asked, his gravelly voice pitched low, gentle. "Captain," Grace said. "He only has one eye, but he can still see everything." Bull looked at the bear's single button eye and the solemn face of the girl holding it, and something shifted behind his scarred, weathered features. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small metal pin, an enamel American flag that he had been carrying since his second tour in the Persian Gulf a lifetime ago. He leaned down and carefully pinned it to Captain's chest. "There," Bull said. "Now he's a decorated veteran. Nothing scares a veteran." Grace looked at the pin on her bear's chest, then up at Bull, and for the first time since Dean had met her, she smiled. It was small and uncertain, like a flower trying to open in a drought, but it was real. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Night fell over the trailer park like a lid being lowered onto a coffin. The desert darkness was absolute, unbroken by street lights or porch lights, the only illumination coming from the pale sliver of moon hanging low over the distant mountains. The temperature dropped from the brutal 112 of the afternoon to a dry, deceptive coolness that felt almost pleasant on the skin, but did nothing to ease the tension inside the trailer. Dean positioned himself near the front window, sitting in the darkness on the floor with his back against the wall, watching the dirt road that served as the trailer park's only entrance. Bull took the rear, covering the back door, and the windows facing the empty desert scrub. Megan sat in the narrow hallway between the 2 bedrooms, the shotgun across her knees, Grace sleeping fitfully against her shoulder in the warm darkness. At 10:14, the silence broke. It was subtle at first, the faint crunch of tires on gravel moving slowly without headlights. Dean pressed his face to the edge of the window and saw a dark pickup truck rolling into the trailer park entrance. Its lights killed its engine barely above idle. Behind it, 30 seconds later, a second vehicle, a sedan, followed the same pattern. "Bull," Dean whispered. "Two vehicles, no lights, coming in quiet." Bull materialized at Dean's shoulder, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for a man of his size. He peered through the crack in the curtain and grunted. Not cops, no light bars, no markings. The pickup's got aftermarket tints. "Buford's cleanup crew," Dean said. "He didn't call the feds. He called you in a favor." The vehicles stopped approximately 50 yards from Lot 44, parking behind a row of darkened trailers. Dean counted 4 men exiting the vehicles. They moved with purpose, spreading out, 2 approaching from the front of the lot and 2 circling around the back. They were not wearing uniforms. They were dressed in dark clothing, and at least 2 of them carried long guns. Dean pulled the Bowie knife from its sheath, the blade catching the faint moonlight. "They're flanking us. 2 coming up the front. 2 circling the back. They think we left." "Megan," Bull called softly down the hallway. "Company. 2 coming your way from the east. You remember what I told you about the choke point?" Megan's voice came back through the darkness, steady and low. "The hallway. Anyone coming through the back door has to pass through a 3-foot wide corridor. I'm 10 feet back with a clear line." "That's my girl," Bull said, and he moved to cover the rear window. Dean pressed himself flat against the wall beside the front door, the knife held low against his thigh. Through the thin aluminum wall, he could hear the soft footsteps approaching, the whisper of boots in dirt, the faint metallic click of a weapon being readied. The door handle turned slowly, testing the lock. Then a shoulder hit the door hard, and the flimsy aluminum buckled inward. The bar stool scraped across the linoleum with a shrieking sound, and the first man came through the doorway in a crouch, a compact rifle held against his shoulder. Dean did not hesitate. He grabbed the barrel of the rifle and wrenched it upward, driving the muzzle toward the ceiling. The man fired reflexively, the shot punching through the thin roof with a deafening crack that rang through the confined space. Dean slammed his knee into the man's midsection, folding him forward, then brought the heavy pommel of the Bowie knife down on the back of his skull. The man dropped like a sack of concrete. The second man was directly behind, stumbling over his fallen partner, trying to bring a pistol to bear in the narrow doorway. Dean kicked the rifle on the floor into the man's ankles, tangling his feet, and lunged forward. They crashed through the broken door, together tumbling down the cinder block step into the dirt yard. The pistol went off the round, burying itself in the ground inches from Dean's hip. Dean drove the knife into the soft ground beside the man's head, close enough to cut his ear, and pressed his forearm across the man's throat. "How many more?" Dean growled, his face inches from the man's. The man's eyes were wide, wild with adrenaline and sudden overwhelming fear. At the back of the trailer, the sounds were louder. A window shattered. The heavy crack of the shotgun erupted twice in quick succession, the sound enormous and percussive in the enclosed space. Then silence. Then Megan's voice, raw and trembling, but unmistakably commanding. "The next one comes through, I won't aim at the wall." Bull's contribution was characteristically efficient. The back door had burst open and a figure had charged in with a crowbar raised. Bull met him in the hallway with a straight right hand that connected with the man's jaw and produced a sound like a baseball hitting a leather glove. The man went down instantly, his body going rigid and then limp, his eyes rolling back to whites. The fourth man, seeing his partner crumple and hearing the shotgun blast from the front, turned and ran. Bull let him go. One witness fleeing in terror was worth more than 4 unconscious bodies. The entire engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. Dean dragged the 2 men from the front yard into the trailer's living room, zip-tying their wrists with the heavy-duty cable ties Bull always carried in his saddlebag. Bull's man was still unconscious, breathing noisily through a jaw that was clearly broken. The man Dean had caught outside was bleeding from the ear and refusing to make eye contact. The fourth man, the one who had fled into the darkness, was a problem. A loose end running through the desert with the knowledge of what had happened here. But Dean made the calculation instantly. Chasing a man through unfamiliar terrain in pitch darkness was an invitation for disaster, and the fleeing man had just watched his 3 partners get dismantled in under 2 minutes. He was not coming back. He was running, and he would keep running, and the story he told when he finally stopped would do more to protect Megan than any lock on any door. Megan emerged from the hallway, the shotgun still in her hands, her face ghostly pale in the moonlight filtering through the shattered window. There were 2 holes in the wall behind the back door where her shots had landed chest height, center mass. She had not been aiming to warn. She had been aiming to kill. The fact that the man at the back door had stumbled at the exact right moment was the only reason he was still breathing. "Are you hit?" Dean asked, scanning her quickly for injuries. "No." Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking, the adrenaline crash beginning its slow, nauseating descent. She lowered the shotgun carefully, placing it on the kitchen counter with deliberate control, as though afraid that if she moved too quickly, the fragile composure holding her together would shatter. Grace appeared in the hallway behind her mother, the closet door swinging open. She was clutching Captain, the one-eyed bear, with Bull's flag pin on his chest, and her blue eyes were yeah, but dream or no. She looked at the men on the floor, at the broken furniture, at the bullet holes in the walls, and then she looked at her mother. "Did you shoot the bad men, Mom?" Megan knelt down, bringing herself to Grace's eye level, and cupped her daughter's face in both hands. "I kept us safe, baby. That's what I did." Dean crouched in front of the man who was conscious. "Who sent you silence?" "I already know the answer. I just want to hear you say it." The man's eyes darted sideways toward the front door, calculating his chances. Bull's massive frame appeared in his peripheral vision, and the calculation died instantly. "Buford," the man muttered. "Sheriff called in a favor, said there was a bay that needed to disappear and a woman who'd seen too much." Dean stood up. He looked at Megan, who was standing at the end of the hallway, the shotgun still in her hands, her chest heaving. Grace was behind her, peeking through the crack of the bedroom closet door, the stuffed bear pressed against her chest. "He tried to have you killed," Dean said quietly. "The sheriff sent men to murder you and take the money." Megan lowered the shotgun slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes enormous. But beneath the shock, beneath the fear, something else was burning. It was not the helpless terror that had defined her for years. It was rage, not the wild, uncontrolled rage of a person lashing out, but a focused, structural fury, the kind that dismantles rather than destroys, that builds a case rather than swings a fist. "The hard drive," Megan said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The camera has been recording the whole time. If Buford's men were in here, if any of them were in this trailer doing business with Wade, they're on the recordings." She walked to the counter, opened the metal box, and pulled out the portable hard drive. She turned to the kitchen table where a battered laptop, the only piece of technology Prescott had allowed her to keep, sat closed and dusty. "What are you doing?" Dean asked. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Megan opened the laptop, connected the hard drive, and began navigating through the files. The screen cast a pale blue glow across her bruised face as she scrolled through folders organized by date. Hundreds of files sorted by month, each one a chapter in the criminal history of Kingman County. She clicked on one at random, and the grainy fisheye footage from the smoke detector camera filled the screen. It showed the living room of the trailer from above, and in the frame, unmistakably, was Sheriff Buford sitting at the kitchen table counting stacks of cash, while Prescott stood beside him with a calculator. The audio was faint but audible, the 2 men discussing amounts and percentages with the casual efficiency of accountants at a quarterly review. She clicked another file. This one showed 2 men Dean did not recognize carrying a heavy duffel bag through the front door, greeted by Prescott. She clicked another and another. Each file was a window into the machine that had been operating in her living room around her daughter, while she sat in the bedroom behind a locked door, pressing a pillow over her ears. "I knew it was happening," Megan said quietly, her eyes on the screen. "I heard the conversations. I smelled the product when they brought it in, but I never looked. I was too afraid to know the details because knowing meant I was complicit, and being complicit meant there was no way out. She turned to Dean. He told me that. Wade told me that if I ever opened my mouth, I was as guilty as he was. He said the law wouldn't protect me because I lived in the same house where the deals happened. I believed him. He was lying, Dean said. Victims aren't accessories. I know that now. Megan turned back to the laptop. I know a lot of things now that I didn't know 3 hours ago. She opened her email, a free account she had created years ago, on a library computer and never told Prescott about, and began uploading files. The internet connection in the trailer was agonizingly slow, a cheap mobile hotspot that Prescott used for personal browsing. But it was enough. I'm sending copies to myself, Megan said, her fingers moving with a purpose that Dean recognized. It was the purpose of a person who has found in the middle of chaos the one thing they can actually control. If anything happens to this hard drive, the files are backed up. Then she picked up Dean's burner phone from the counter. Can I use this? Dean nodded. Megan dialed a number. It rang twice before a clipped professional voice answered. Dean could not hear the words, but he watched Megan's face as she spoke, and he watched the transformation complete itself. The hunched shoulders straightened. The trembling hands went still. The voice that had been a whisper for 2 years found its full volume. My name is Megan Lawson. I need to speak to the FBI field office in Phoenix. I have video evidence of a narcotics distribution ring operating out of the Kingman County Sheriff's Department. I have names, dates, and recordings. I also have 4 men tied up in my living room who were sent by the sheriff to kill me and destroy the evidence. I need federal agents here tonight. She hung up and placed the phone on the counter. The trailer was silent. Bull looked at Dean. Dean looked at Megan. The woman who had been cowering in the kitchen corner 2 hours ago, bleeding and broken, had just made the phone call that would bring down an entire county's power structure. She had not waited for someone to rescue her. She had loaded the gun, fired the shots, backed up the evidence, and called the cavalry herself. How long until they get here? Dean asked. They said 45 minutes from Phoenix. There's a team already mobilized from the Prescott arrest. Dean looked at Bull. Can you hold this position for 45 minutes? I can hold this position for 45 days, Bull replied, settling his massive frame into the doorway like a boulder rolled across a cave mouth. Dean walked to the front window and looked out at the dark trailer park. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The moon had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dirt lots and rusted trailers. The silence was total, the kind of silence that only exists in the aftermath of violence, a held breath between the end of one crisis and the beginning of the next. At 11:22, the sound of helicopters broke the desert silence. 2 of them approaching fast from the south, their searchlights cutting white circles across the dark landscape. Behind the helicopters, a convoy of dark SUVs tore into Kingman from the interstate, their lights flashing their sirens, cutting through the night. The FBI descended on the trailer park with the overwhelming force of an organization that had been handed a gift-wrapped case. Agents in tactical gear swarmed Lot 44, securing the perimeter, photographing the scene, bagging the duffel bag of cash and drugs with the meticulous care of archaeologists handling ancient artifacts. The 4 men Dean and Bull had subdued were hauled out in handcuffs, each one refusing to speak until they were loaded into separate vehicles and driven in separate directions, a standard technique for breaking solidarity. Special Agent Harrison, the sharp-suited man who had been coordinating the operation from Phoenix, arrived in the last vehicle. He was a lean, precise man in his late 40s with the controlled energy of someone who had been waiting years for a case like this to land on his desk. He walked through the trailer, surveying the wreckage, the blood, the bullet holes, and the empty vent where the duffel bag had been hidden. Then he turned to Megan. Mr. Lawson, you're the one who called. Megan nodded. And you have additional evidence beyond what was recovered here. Megan handed him the portable hard drive. Everything. Video recordings from a hidden camera, dozens of files going back at least 18 months. Sheriff Buford, Deputy Prescott, and at least 6 other individuals are clearly identifiable. Harrison took the hard drive with both hands, handling it as if it were made of glass. He looked at Megan with an expression that combined professional admiration with something more personal, the look of a man who recognized courage when he saw it. "We have teams moving in Sheriff Buford right now. He was picked up trying to cross the county line 15 minutes ago with a suitcase and $60,000 in cash from his home safe. He's already asking for a lawyer." "In Prescott?" Megan asked. "In federal holding. He started talking before his booking was complete. He's offering to testify against everyone from Buford to Salinas in exchange for witness protection." "I'm testifying," Megan said, and the words came out with the force and finality of a door being locked. Not a question, not a negotiation, a declaration. Harrison studied her for a long moment. He had interviewed hundreds of witnesses in his career, men and women who had seen terrible things and wanted nothing more than to forget them. Most witnesses had to be coaxed, reassured, promised safety and anonymity before they would agree to take the stand. This woman, standing in the wreckage of her own home with bruises on her face and shotgun residue on her hands, was volunteering. "Ms. Lawson, I want to be clear about what testifying means. It means depositions, grand jury appearances, cross-examination by defense attorneys who will try to destroy your credibility. It means your name in court documents. It means looking at the men who hurt you across a courtroom. Are you sure?" "I've been looking at the man who hurt me across a kitchen table for 2 years," Megan said. "A courtroom is an improvement." Harrison nodded slowly, a trace of something like respect crossing his professional features. "There are other women," Megan continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I'm not the only one. Wade controlled other people in this town the same way he controlled me. Threats, intimidation, the badge. I know at least 3 other women who were too afraid to say anything. If I testify, maybe they will too." Dean, standing in the shadows near the door, heard these words and felt something shift inside him. He had ridden into this trailer park to help a little girl to neutralize a threat, to solve a problem with the blunt instruments he knew best: muscle and intimidation, and the weight of his club's reputation. But what he was witnessing now was something else entirely. This was not a rescue. This was a rising. "We'll arrange relocation," Harrison said. "Immediate and comprehensive. You won't have to spend another night in this county." As the FBI agents swarmed the trailer, as the helicopters circled overhead, and the sirens painted the desert in red and blue, Dean and Bull stood at the edge of the parking lot, partially obscured by the shadow of the rusted Ford Bronco. They were invisible now, 2 dark figures in leather, swallowed by the chaos of a federal operation. Harrison approached them. "You two," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I know who you are, I know your patches, and I know what club you ride with. I should be asking you a lot of very uncomfortable questions right now." Dean said nothing. But the anonymous tip that started all of this came from a burner phone that doesn't exist anymore. The woman inside says her injuries were caused exclusively by Deputy Prescott. She says 2 concerned citizens helped her secure the evidence and call for help. Concerned citizens. Harrison let the phrase hang in the air. "You weren't here. You were never here. If I see your faces in this county tomorrow, that courtesy expires." Dean reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick fold of bills. He peeled off several and held them out to Harrison. "Give these to the woman. For the road. She's going to need it before the government gets its act together." Harrison looked at the money, looked at Dean, and took it. "You two should be on the interstate in the next 10 minutes. "Already gone," Bull said, and they walked to their bikes. Megan appeared at the door of the trailer as they were strapping their saddlebags. Grace was beside her, wide awake, her eyes catching the red and blue lights. Megan held the battered suitcase in one hand and her daughter's hand in the other. "Dean," she called out, and her voice carried across the parking lot, clear and strong and unbroken. He looked back. "Thank you," she said. And then, because the words were not enough, because no words could be enough for what had happened in the last 6 hours, she simply held his gaze across the dark, crowded, chaotic trailer park, and Dean saw in her eyes everything she could not say. He saw a woman who had been dismantled by violence and was already in this moment beginning the wooing and brutal work of rebuilding herself from the foundation up. Dean nodded once. Then he looked at Grace. The little girl raised her hand and waved a small, tentative movement that contained within it the entire weight of the evening. She was not crying. She had stopped crying hours ago. Dean kicked the engines to life. The massive V-twin roared its sound, swallowing the sirens and the helicopter blades and the shouted commands of federal agents. Bull fired up beside him, and together they rolled out of the Suncrest trailer park, leaving behind the dust and the blood and the ruins of a corrupt empire that a 7-year-old girl had brought crashing down with a crumpled $10 bill. They stopped at the gas station at the edge of town to fuel up. The same attendant who had watched them arrive that afternoon was still behind the bulletproof glass, but the look in his eyes had changed. This trailer park had no secrets in a town this small. Word traveled through Kingman like heat through metal, fast and impossible to contain. The attendant did not know the details, but he knew something had happened at Suncrest, something involving the bikers and the deputy everyone feared. And the air between the bulletproof glass and the fuel pumps was charged with a new uncertain energy. Dean paid cash for the fuel and bought 2 bottles of water and a bag of beef jerky. Bull leaned against his bike, cracking his knuckles, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot with the habitual vigilance of a man who never truly stopped watching. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Bull said, tearing into a strip of jerky. "What? The money, 200 grand in shrink-wrapped hundreds just sitting in the vent of a trailer where a woman scrubs motel rooms for $9 an hour. The world is designed wrong, brother." "The world was designed by men like Buford," Dean replied. "We just showed up and rearranged the furniture." They rode into the desert darkness, following the white line of the highway east toward Texas. The stars above the Arizona desert were vivid and countless, a canopy of cold light that stretched from horizon to horizon. The air was cool now, rushing past their faces at 70 miles an hour, carrying the scent of sage and creosote and the distant, fading smell of spent gunpowder. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say that the road was not already saying for them. The miles scrolled beneath their tires, and with each one the trailer park fell further behind, shrinking in the mirrors, until it was nothing but a memory and a red glow on the horizon where the FBI's light still flickered. They rode through the rest of the night and into the dawn. The sun rose behind them, turning the eastern sky from black to indigo to a pale, washed-out blue that spread across the New Mexico landscape like a bruise healing in reverse. They stopped at a truck stop outside Gallup for gas and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during a previous administration. Bull fell asleep on a bench outside the restrooms, his massive frame folded into a position that looked structurally impossible. Dean sat on the concrete curb beside his bike, watching the 18-wheelers come and go, and thought about the weight of decisions. Every choice he had made in the last 24 hours had been wrong by the standards of the club. They had interfered in a local matter. They had assaulted a law enforcement officer. They had exposed the club to federal scrutiny. They had acted on emotion rather than strategy, on impulse rather than protocol. The leadership in Fort Worth would have questions, and the answers would not satisfy them. But Dean had been in the club for 22 years, and in those 22 years, he had done things that kept him awake at night and things that let him sleep. The things that let him sleep were few, and they were the things he carried forward like stones in his pocket, smooth and heavy and irreplaceable. What had happened in that trailer was going into the pocket. It was going to stay there for the rest of his life. But Dean knew as surely as he knew the sound of his own engine that the events of this day would follow him for the rest of his life. Not as a burden, not as a regret, but as a compass point, a fixed star by which all future decisions would be measured. A little girl had walked up to his table and asked him to be the man he had stopped believing he could be. And for one sweltering, violent, impossibly consequential afternoon, he had said yes. The silence that descended on Kingman in the days following the raid was not peace. It was the stunned, ringing quiet of a town that had just been hit by an earthquake and was still waiting for the aftershocks. News vans from Phoenix and Flagstaff choked the main street. Federal vehicles with tinted windows lined the parking lot of the county precinct. Agents in windbreakers stenciled with FBI and DEA carried boxes of files and computer towers out of the building in a steady procession that lasted 3 days. Sheriff Harold Buford was arrested at a gas station 17 miles from the county line, sitting in his personal truck with a suitcase $60,000 in cash and a passport he had never told his wife about. He was charged with racketeering conspiracy to distribute narcotics, obstruction of justice, and accessory to attempted murder. He did not go quietly. He screamed about constitutional rights in illegal searches until a federal agent placed a hand on the back of his head and guided him firmly into the rear of an armored transport vehicle. The Stetson fell off in the parking lot. No one picked it up. Deputy Wade Prescott was transported to a federal detention facility in Florence, Arizona, 200 miles from Kingman, where he was held in protective custody. His knee required 2 surgeries and would never function properly again. Within 72 hours of his arrest, Prescott had signed a cooperation agreement with the United States Attorney's Office, offering to testify against Buford against the cartel contacts he had dealt with against every name in the ledger in exchange for a reduced sentence and relocation after his prison term. He gave up everything: names, routes, bank accounts, safe houses. He gave it all up with the desperate, flailing urgency of a man who knew that the people he had worked for would kill him the moment they got the chance. The information Prescott provided, combined with the video evidence from the hard drive Megan had recovered, triggered a cascade of federal actions that spread far beyond Kingman. A raid on a ranch property south of Tucson netted 14 arrests and the seizure of over $3 million in cash and narcotics. An auto body shop in Bullhead City was shuttered, its owner arrested while trying to destroy financial records with a bonfire in the parking lot. A used car dealership in Lake Havasu City, which had been laundering money through fraudulent vehicle sales for half a decade, was seized by federal marshals on a Tuesday morning while customers browsed the lot oblivious. The network that Prescott had helped build and Buford had helped protect was unraveled in weeks, its roots pulled from the desert soil with a thoroughness that surprised even the federal prosecutors who had been tracking cartel activity in the region for years. And at the center of it all, the thread that connected every arrest, every seizure, every indictment was the testimony of a woman named Megan Lawson. But before the testimony came the reckoning. In the days immediately following the raid, Megan's name became a quiet legend in the small, terrified community of Suncrest Trailer Park. The neighbors who had locked their doors and drawn their curtains for years, who had heard the screaming from Lot 44 and done nothing because doing something meant confronting a man with a badge and a gun, now came forward one by one. Old Mrs. Fletcher from Lot 38 knocked on the door of the temporary safe house where the FBI had placed Megan and handed over a spiral-bound notebook in which she had recorded every instance of the ailments she had witnessed through her kitchen window dates and times logged with the meticulous precision of a retired schoolteacher who still believed in documentation. Tommy Ruiz from Lot 51, a retired mechanic who had once confronted Prescott about the noise and been rewarded with a traffic stop every day for 3 weeks, provided a statement that corroborated the pattern of intimidation. The most important visitor came on the 3rd day. Donna Farley, 31 years old, mother of 2, showed up at the FBI's temporary command center at the Kingman Holiday Inn with bruises on her arms that matched the ones Megan had carried for years. She asked for Agent Harrison by name, sat down in a folding chair, and told a story that was achingly, sickeningly familiar. Prescott had targeted her 6 months after he had moved in with Megan. He had used the same tactics, the same threats, the same badge. Donna had been keeping his overflow inventory, smaller quantities of wishes and product in a storage unit she rented under her own name. She had been too afraid to speak until she saw the news coverage of Megan's case and realized for the first time that the monster could be stopped. 2 more women came forward within the week. The pattern was identical each time. Prescott identified vulnerable women, single mothers with limited resources and no family support, ingratiated himself, established control, and then converted their homes into nodes in his distribution network. The women were not accomplices. They were hostages who happened to have addresses. Megan and Grace were relocated within 48 hours of the raid. Susan Hayes, a senior victims advocate with the state attorney's office, arrived at a temporary safe house in Flagstaff, where the FBI had placed them overnight. She was a trim, composed woman in a navy suit carrying a thick manila folder and an expression of practiced compassion that somehow managed to feel genuine. "Mr. Lawson, we have options for you," Hayes said, sitting across a small table in the kitchenette of the safe house. Grace was in the next room, watching cartoons on a borrowed television, the volume turned up to drown out the conversation. "The Witness Security Program can provide you with a new identity, new documentation, relocation to a state of your choosing. The government will cover housing and expenses for the initial transition period." Megan listened, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The bruises on her face had deepened overnight, the purple spreading and darkening around her eye. But her posture was different from the woman who had been cowering in the kitchen of Lot 44. She sat upright, her shoulders back, her gaze steady and direct. "I don't want a new identity," Megan said. "My name is Megan Lawson. My daughter's name is Grace Lawson. Those are the names my husband gave us, and I'm not letting Wade Prescott take that too." Hayes nodded, making a note. "Relocation without identity change is possible, though it offers less comprehensive protection. Are you still willing to testify at the federal trial?" "I told Agent Harrison I would testify, and I meant it. But I want something else first." Megan set the coffee cup down and leaned forward. "I know I'm not the only one. Wade controlled other women in Kingman. He had a pattern. He'd find single mothers, women with no resources, no family, no way to fight back. He'd move in, take over, and use them. I know of at least 3 others: Maria Gutierrez, who works at the truck stop, Donna Farley, who lives in the park south of town, and a woman named Janine, whose last name I never learned, who used to clean the same motel I did until she disappeared 6 months ago." Hayes looked up from her notepad, her expression sharpening. "Disappeared. Wade said she moved away. I never believed it. Nobody just moves away from Kingman without telling anyone." Hayes made a note, her pen moving quickly. "I'll pass these names to Agent Harrison immediately. If there are additional victims, their testimony will strengthen the case significantly." "That's why I'm testifying," Megan said. "Not for revenge, not because I want to see Wade in prison, although I do. I'm testifying because somewhere in that town there are women sitting in dark rooms right now, afraid to breathe too loud, and they need to see that someone got out. They need to see that the badge doesn't make him God." The trial preparation took months. Megan and Grace were relocated to a small, rain-soaked town in the Pacific Northwest, nestled in the shadow of the Cascade Range in Oregon. The town was everything Kingman was not. Green instead of brown, cool instead of scorching, quiet in a way that felt healing rather than oppressive. The state provided a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a brick building that overlooked a narrow creek lined with cedar trees. The sound of the water running over the rocks was constant, a gentle liquid murmur that replaced the roar of highway traffic Megan had fallen asleep to for years. She secured a job as a receptionist at a pediatric dental clinic, a position arranged through the Victims Advocacy Office. The work was simple, steady, and predictable, exactly what she needed. She answered phones, scheduled appointments, and filed insurance paperwork in a bright, clean office where the biggest emergency was a child afraid of the tooth fairy. After years of navigating the unpredictable violence of life with Prescott, the mundane routine of the dental clinic felt like a form of therapy. Her coworkers were kind, in the careful, respectful way of people who sensed a history without needing to know the details. The office manager, a stout woman named Linda, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and kept hard candies in a ceramic bowl on her desk, invited Megan to lunch on her first day. They sat at a sandwich shop across the street, and Linda talked about her grandchildren and the garden she was planting and the book club she ran at the library on Thursday evenings. She did not ask Megan where she came from or why she had moved. She simply talked, filling the air with the warm, inconsequential details of a normal life. And Megan sat across from her and listened and felt for the first time in years like a person rather than a hostage. The apartment itself was a revelation. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that overlooked the creek, a bathroom with a lock that worked, and walls thick enough that the sound of a neighbor's television was a muffled hum rather than a constant intrusion. Megan spent the first week cleaning it with an obsessive thoroughness, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, arranging and rearranging the modest furniture the state had provided, creating order in the only space she could control. It was a habit born of years of anxiety, but in this context, it felt less like a compulsion and more like a reclamation. This was her space, her kitchen, her walls. No one was going to kick down her door or hide contraband in her air ducts or use her home as a front for criminal operations. The apartment was hers, and the simple, radical fact of that ownership transformed her relationship with every room in it. Grace enrolled in the local elementary school. On her first day, she wore the yellow sundress, washed and hemmed to fit properly, and carried her backpack with Captain, the one-eyed bear, peeking out from the top pocket, the enamel flag pin still fastened to his chest. The other children were curious about the quiet new girl with the blue eyes and the funny bear, and within a week, Grace had been invited to join a soccer team. Within a month, she had a best friend named Hannah, who lived 2 blocks away and owned a golden retriever named Biscuit. The transformation in Grace was gradual but unmistakable. In Kingman, she had been a child who moved through the world with the cautious hypervigilance of a small animal in predator territory, always listening for the crunch of boots on gravel, always calculating the distance to the nearest closet or hiding place. In Oregon, surrounded by children who had never known violence, by teachers who noticed her and praised her and treated her like she mattered, the survival instinct that had kept her alive began to soften into something more normal, more childlike. She started raising her hand in class. She laughed during recess, a sound that startled Megan the first time she heard it from across the playground, because she had not heard her daughter truly laugh, in longer than she could remember. One evening in September, 3 months after they arrived, Grace brought home a crayon drawing from school. It showed 2 large figures on motorcycles drawn in heavy black crayon riding on a road that curved toward a small house with a green lawn. Above the house in Grace's careful, uneven letters were the words, "My heroes." Megan taped it to the refrigerator where it remained for the rest of the year. The hypervigilance faded slowly like a bruise. Megan still checked the locks 3 times before bed. She still flinched when a car door slammed too loudly in the parking lot. She still dreamed about the trailer, about the sound of boots on gravel, about the weight of a hand on her throat. But the dreams came less frequently, and the flinching became a habit rather than a terror. And one evening in October, 4 months after they arrived, she realized she had gone an entire day without thinking about Wade Prescott. The federal trial was scheduled for January. Megan flew to Phoenix, leaving Grace with a trusted neighbor, and spent 3 days being prepared by federal prosecutors. They walked her through the evidence, coached her on courtroom procedure, warned her about the tactics the defense would use. Prescott's attorney, a sharp, expensive lawyer paid for by sources the prosecution was still trying to trace, intended to argue that the evidence from the hidden camera was illegally obtained, that Megan had been an active participant in the conspiracy rather than a victim, and that the 2 unidentified bikers who had initiated the confrontation were the true criminals in the case. The courtroom was cold and institutional, a federal courthouse in Phoenix with high ceilings and fluorescent lights that gave everyone the pallor of the recently deceased. Megan sat in the witness box on the second day of the trial, facing a room full of strangers, attorneys, jurors, reporters, federal agents, and in the defendant's section, seated between his lawyer and a U.S. Marshal, Wade Prescott. He looked diminished. The arrogant swagger, the military posture, the cold authority that had made him terrifying were gone. He sat in a wheelchair, his ruined knee in a brace, wearing an ill-fitting suit that had replaced his uniform. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. Prison had stripped him of the physical power that had been his primary weapon, and what remained was a small, bitter man who could not meet Megan's gaze. The defense attorney rose. He was a tall man with gray temples and a courtroom voice that projected calm authority. Ms. Lawson, isn't it true that you were aware of the illegal activities taking place in your home for over 18 months and failed to report them to law enforcement? Megan looked at the attorney, then at the jury. 12 faces, men and women ranging in age from their 30s to their 70s. She had practiced this moment with the prosecutors, rehearsed her answers, memorized the key points she needed to convey. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was not the rehearsed script. It was the truth, raw and unedited, spoken with the quiet force of a woman who had nothing left to lose and nothing left to hide. I was aware, Megan said. I heard it. I smelled it. I saw men come and go from my living room carrying bags of money while my daughter slept 10 feet away behind a locked door. And I said nothing. I said nothing because the man who was doing it wore a badge and a gun, and he told me every single day that if I opened my mouth, he would destroy me, arrest me, and take my child. And I believed him because in Kingman, Arizona, Deputy Wade Prescott was the law. The sheriff was his friend, the judge was his poker buddy. The system that was supposed to protect me was the system that was holding me prisoner. She paused, took a breath, and continued. You want to know why I didn't report it? Because I called the domestic violence hotline once 2 years ago, and 2 days later, Wade came home and told me he'd heard the call. He said his friends at the phone company flagged it. He broke 2 of my ribs that night and told me if I ever called anyone again, they'd find my body in the desert and Grace would grow up in a group home. So yes, I knew. And I was silent. Not because I was complicit, but because I was surviving. The courtroom was dead quiet. Several jurors were visibly affected, one woman pressing a tissue to her eyes, an older man in the back row sitting with his jaw clenched and his hands balled into fists on his knees. The defense attorney paused, recalibrating, and Megan saw it, the slight hesitation, the quick glance at his client, the micro expression of a lawyer who has just realized his line of attack has backfired catastrophically. Ms. Lawson, the prosecution has presented video evidence from a hidden camera in your home. Are you aware of who installed that camera? Wade installed it. He told me it was for security. He didn't tell me it was recording his business meetings. I found out the camera existed when I found the hard drive he kept under our bed. I found it on the night 2 strangers risked their lives to protect my daughter and me. And I decided that I was done being afraid. And these strangers, can you identify them? The prosecution maintains that the confrontation with Deputy Prescott was initiated by 2 unidentified individuals who assaulted a sworn law enforcement officer. Megan looked directly at the defense attorney. I can tell you that 2 men entered my home on the day in question. I can tell you that they were concerned citizens who responded to a child's plea for help. I can tell you that Deputy Prescott drew his weapon first and fired first. And I can tell you that if those men had not been there, my daughter and I would be buried in the Arizona desert right now, because that is exactly what Wade Prescott told me he intended to do. The defense attorney sat down. He did not ask another question. The prosecution then played the video evidence. The courtroom watched in silence as the grainy footage showed Sheriff Buford counting money, showed Prescott directing couriers, showed the systematic operation of a narcotics network running through the living room of a single mother's trailer. Megan sat in the witness box and watched the jury's faces as they absorbed what they were seeing. She watched the horror register, the anger build the verdict form behind their eyes before a single ballot was cast. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Prescott was convicted on all counts: racketeering, narcotics, distribution, assault, domestic violence, and 6 counts of witness intimidation. The foreman, a retired postal worker from Scottsdale with silver hair and steady hands, read the verdicts in a clear, unhurried voice that echoed off the high courtroom ceiling. With each count, with each utterance of the word guilty, Megan felt something loosen in her chest, a knot that had been tightening for years, thread by thread, until it had become so much a part of her that she had forgotten what breathing without it felt like. Prescott sat motionless in his wheelchair as the verdicts were read. He did not react. He did not cry or shout or slump. He simply stared at the table in front of him with the blank, hollowed expression of a man who had already died and was merely waiting for his body to acknowledge the fact. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. Prescott did not seem to notice. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 23 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole for the first 15. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had presided over the case with the cold precision of a surgeon, added a lengthy commentary to the sentencing that was reprinted in newspapers across the state. She spoke about the sacred trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. She spoke about the particular cruelty of a man who uses his authority to imprison the people he claims to protect. And she spoke about courage, specifically the courage of a woman who had endured years of systematic abuse and still found the strength to stand in a courtroom and speak the truth. Megan was not present for the sentencing. She had done what she came to do. She had looked the monster in the face, told the world what he was, and watched the system that had failed her finally belatedly do its job. She did not need to see the cage door close. She already knew the sound. Sheriff Buford tried separately 2 months later, using the same evidence, was convicted on similar charges. He received 18 years. The network was dismantled. The routes were shut down. And Megan Lawson walked out of the federal courthouse in Phoenix into the warm January sun and breathed air that tasted for the first time in years like freedom. She returned to Oregon, to the apartment above the creek, to the dental clinic, in the predictable routine and the sound of Grace laughing with her friend Hannah in the backyard. The trial had taken something out of her, a final expenditure of the last reserves of fear and anger she had been carrying. In its place was an exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could reach. But beneath the exhaustion, like the first green shoot pushing through scorched earth, was something new. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the quiet, tentative possibility of happiness. The understanding that the future was no longer a threat, but an open field. Spring came to Oregon in shades of green that Megan had never seen in Arizona. The trees along the creek exploded with new leaves, their canopies so thick that walking beneath them felt like entering a cathedral made of living wood. The rain softened to a gentle mist that Grace called fairy fog, and the creek swelled with snow melt from the mountains, its voice rising from a murmur to a steady, confident song that filled the apartment through the open windows. Megan started a garden on the small balcony of their apartment. Tomatoes, basil, and a single stubborn sunflower that Grace had planted from a seed and watered every morning with the grave, focused attention of a child performing an important duty. When the sunflower finally bloomed in late May, its face turned toward the window of their apartment, Grace dragged Megan onto the balcony and pointed at it with both hands bouncing on her toes. "It grew, Mom. We made something grow." The words landed in Megan's chest with a force that was entirely out of proportion to a sunflower, because the sunflower was not really about the sunflower. It was about the capacity to nurture something fragile and watch it thrive, a capacity that Prescott had tried to destroy and failed. On a Tuesday evening in April, exactly 14 months after they had fled Kingman, Megan walked to the communal mail area in the lobby of their apartment building. The mailbox held the usual collection of utility bills, credit card offers, and grocery store circulars. But wedged between the electric bill and a flyer for a pizza chain was a thick white envelope made of heavy, expensive paper. The kind of paper used by law firms and financial institutions. There was no return address, just her name, Megan Lawson, typed in clean black letters on the front. The postmark was from a corporate processing center in Delaware. She carried it upstairs, set it on the kitchen counter, and opened it with a butter knife. Inside was a single sheet of legal stationery, folded precisely into thirds. Tucked inside the fold was a certified cashier's check. The check was issued by an LLC, registered in Texas, a company name she did not recognize. It was made payable to the Grace Lawson Educational Trust. The amount printed in bold black numbers was $50,000. Megan's hand went to her mouth. The kitchen blurred as tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, warm and fast, and completely beyond her control. She sat down heavily on the kitchen chair, the check trembling in her fingers, trying to comprehend what she was holding. $50,000. Enough to send Grace to college. Enough to change the trajectory of a child's life. It was clean money routed through a legitimate legal structure with the kind of meticulous financial architecture that spoke of expensive attorneys and organizations that operated as much in the shadows of corporate law as in the daylight of the open road. Attached to the check was a small white card, no signature, no name, no message, just a single emblem stamped in faded black ink in the bottom right corner, a winged skull. Megan pressed the card against her chest and closed her eyes. They had not forgotten. From across state lines, through layers of shell companies and anonymous trusts, they had reached out and quietly, permanently altered the future of a little girl who had once offered them everything she had. She walked down the hallway to Grace's bedroom. The door was open. Grace was asleep, her blonde hair fanned across the pillow, her breathing slow and even. Captain the Bear sat on the nightstand beside a stack of library books in a small wooden picture frame. Megan picked up the frame and looked at it. Behind the glass, pressed flat and perfectly preserved, was a crumpled, faded, slightly torn $10 bill. Megan set the frame back down, bent, and kissed her daughter's forehead and walked back to the kitchen. She sat at the table for a noye time, holding the check and the card, listening to the rain against the windows and the creek running over the rocks below. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not check the locks before she went to bed. The highway east of Kingman stretched like a scar across the desert floor. Dean Gallagher and Bull Rooney had ridden it in silence for 2 days, stopping only for fuel and coffee, and the kind of roadside meals that tasted the same in every state. The distance between Arizona and Texas was not measured in miles, but in the slow, grinding recalibration of men returning from a war they had not planned to fight. They stopped at a gas station near Amarillo to refuel. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the flat Texas plains, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and crimson. Bull leaned against his bike, cracking open a bottle of water, and watched Dean stare at the horizon. "You've been quiet, brother," Bull said. "Quieter than usual, which is saying something." "I keep thinking about the girl," Dean said. He did not specify which girl. He did not need to. 7 years old, she broke her piggy bank, walked into a room full of grown men who were too scared to move, and asked 2 strangers for help. She was braver than every adult in that diner. "She was braver than most men I've ridden with," Bull agreed. "And I keep thinking about Chloe. My Chloe. She's 12 now. The last time I saw her, she was 7, the same age as Grace." Dean paused, the weight of the parallel sitting heavy on his chest. 5 years, Bull. I told myself I was keeping her safe by staying away, that the road was too dangerous, that my life was too dark. But that's a lie. I wasn't protecting her. I was hiding. Bull said nothing. He knew when Dean needed silence and when he needed an audience, and right now the man needed to speak the words aloud, to hear them in his own voice, to make them real. Megan Lawson was living in a cage. A literal cage built by a man with a badge and a gun. And when the moment came, when the door opened, she didn't wait for permission. She picked up the shotgun. She found the evidence. She made the call. She saved herself. Dean's jaw tightened. And me, I've been sending checks from the road for 5 years. Like that makes me a father. It doesn't. It makes me a coward with good penmanship. "So what are you going to do about it?" Bull asked, though they both already knew the answer. They split at the interchange outside of Amarillo. Bull pulled his bike alongside Dean's, and for a moment the 2 men sat side by side, engines idling, looking at the diverging highways. Bull reached across and gripped Dean's shoulder, a brief, firm gesture that carried the weight of decades of brotherhood. "Ride safe, Iron," Bull said, using Dean's road name one final time. "I'll cover for you at the table. Take all the time you need." "Thank you, brother, for everything." Bull nodded, peeled south toward Fort Worth, and Dean was alone on the highway for the first time in days. The solitude was immediate and immense. Without Bull beside him, without the anchor of companionship, there was nothing between Dean and his thoughts were merciless. He rode for 2 hours through the darkening Texas landscape, and with every mile the conversation in his head grew louder. He thought about Megan's face when she stood up in that kitchen, bruised and bleeding but unbroken, and said she would testify. He thought about Grace's laugh when Bull pinned the flag on her bear. He thought about the $10 bill crumpled and damp with a child's sweat, and the courage it represented, the willingness to offer everything you have, even when everything you have is almost nothing. He thought about Chloe asking her mother if her father was dead, because death was the only explanation a 12-year-old could accept for such a total absence. The suburbs of North Dallas hit him like a change in atmosphere, a shift, from the raw, lawless openness of the highway to the manicured, regulated precision of a world that operated on different rules. His bike was too loud for these streets. His leather was too dirty. The patch on his back drew stares from drivers of luxury cars and mothers pushing strollers. He was an intruder, and everyone within earshot knew it. He found the house from memory, a 2-story brick colonial with white trim, a green lawn, and a bicycle leaning against the porch railing. It was exactly as he remembered it, or almost. The tree in the front yard was taller. The mailbox was different, changed from the plain black box he had installed himself to a decorative copper model with a flag. A new fence ran along the side yard, painted white, enclosing a backyard he could not see. 5 years of accumulated changes, each one a reminder of the time he had allowed to pass, each one evidence of a life continuing without him. There was a bumper sticker on Rachel's car in the driveway, a purple and gold rectangle that read Northridge Soccer Mom. Chloe played soccer. He had not known that. He did not know what grade she was in, what her favorite subject was, whether she liked the same old westerns her grandfather used to watch. He did not know if she was left-handed or right-handed. He did not know if she still slept with a nightlight or if she had outgrown it. He did not know any of the 1,000 small essential details that constitute the knowledge a father should have of his child, and the absence of that knowledge was a void so vast it took his breath away. He killed the engine and sat on his bike for a long time staring at the house. His hands, which had not shaken when facing down a loaded weapon in a desert trailer park, were trembling now, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that started in his fingers and spread to his wrists. The courage required to ride into danger was a fundamentally different thing from the courage required to face the consequences of your own failures. The first was adrenaline. The second was humility. And humility for a man like Dean Gallagher was far more terrifying than any gun. He dismounted, walked up the concrete driveway, and rang the doorbell. The door opened and Rachel stood in the frame. She was older, the stress of solo parenthood visible in the lines around her eyes. But she was beautiful in the way that strong women are beautiful, not despite the years, but because of them. When she saw Dean, her face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: shock, anger, confusion, and beneath all of them, a deep and complicated sorrow. Dean. She whispered his name, her voice a mixture of shock, anger, and a deep buried sorrow. "What are you doing here?" "I know I don't have the right," Dean said, and his voice, the same voice that had commanded rooms and intimidated sheriffs, cracked on the word right. "I know I gave up that right 5 years ago. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here because something happened this week that made me understand what I really did when I left." Rachel's arms crossed over her chest. A defensive posture, he recognized a wall she had built against the pain of his absence. "You can't just show up, Dean. She's 12. She asked about you. She asked me last month if you were dead because she couldn't think of another reason a father would disappear." The words hit Dean like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, and behind them, he saw a little girl in a yellow sundress pushing a $10 bill across a table, asking strangers for the help her father could not provide. "I know," Dean whispered, "and I can't fix that. I can't give her back 5 years. But I can stand on this porch and tell her the truth. I can look her in the eye and say I'm sorry. And if she slams the door in my face, I'll deserve it. But she deserves to hear the words." Before Rachel could respond, a voice came from inside the house. "Mom, who's at the door?" Footsteps in the hallway. A girl appeared behind Rachel, taller than Dean had imagined, with his dark hair and Rachel's soft features. She was wearing a soccer uniform and holding a half-eaten apple, and she looked at the large, rough-edged man standing on her porch with an expression of confusion that slowly, gradually transformed into something else. Recognition. Not of his face, because 5 years had blurred the details, but of something deeper. The shape of his hands, the color of his eyes, the way he stood, weight-balanced shoulders squared, a mirror of her own unconscious posture. "Dad," Chloe whispered. A tear broke loose from Dean's right eye and tracked down his weathered, road-beaten cheek. He did not wipe it away. He had spent 2 decades building walls, layers of leather and steel and reputation and silence, and in this moment, standing on a porch in Dallas, he let them fall. "Hi, Chloe," he said, and his voice broke completely on her name, the 2 syllables carrying 20 years of regret compressed into a single devastating sound. Rachel looked at her daughter, then at Dean. The anger was still there, and it would remain for a long time, perhaps forever. But the mother in her recognized something that the wife could not forgive. Her daughter needed this. Chloe needed to see her father, to hear his voice, to know that she had not been abandoned because she was unworthy of love, but because the man who loved her had been too broken to show it. Rachel stepped aside. Dean walked into the house, leaving the harsh Texas sunlight behind, crossing from one world into another. He knelt in the hallway, bringing himself to Chloe's eye level, the way he had knelt for Grace in the trailer, the way he should have been kneeling for his own daughter every day of her life. Chloe took a step toward him, then another. Her hand reached out hesitant and touched his face, her fingertips tracing the lines and scars and weather-beaten terrain of a father she was meeting again for the first time. "You came back," she said, and her voice held no accusation, no anger, just the simple, staggering wonder of a child who had been praying for a miracle and finally received one. "I came back," Dean said, "and I'm not going to explain it all today because it will take longer than today to explain. But I need you to know one thing, Chloe. I never stopped loving you, not for one single mile of every road I ever rode. You were in my chest the whole time, right next to the engine." "Then why did you leave?" Chloe asked, and the question was so simple, so devastatingly direct that it cut through every defense Dean had ever built. There was no evasion available, no road to ride down, no distraction to grab, just a 12-year-old girl and a question that deserved the truth. "Because I was scared," Dean said, "not of the world, of myself. I was scared that my life would hurt you, and instead of fixing my life, I just removed myself from yours. And that was the worst mistake I've ever made. Worse than anything the road ever cost me." Chloe studied his face, searching for something, some proof that the words were real and not just another form of the absence she had learned to live with. Whatever she found must have been enough, because she stepped forward, closed the remaining distance between them, and wrapped her arms around his neck. Dean held his daughter for the first time in 5 years. His massive frame folded around her small body, his face buried in her dark hair, his shoulders shaking with a grief and gratitude that he had no words for and no need to name. She smelled like grass and apple juice and something floral that must have been her shampoo, and the ordinariness of it, the simple domestic normalcy that he had denied himself for half a decade, was more overwhelming than anything the desert had thrown at him. Rachel watched from the doorway, her arms still crossed, her eyes glistening. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness would take time, if it came at all. But she recognized the truth of what she was seeing. Something had changed in Dean Gallagher. Some wall had fallen, some road had finally led him back. The 5 minutes Rachel had offered stretched into an hour. They sat at the kitchen table, Chloe between her parents, asking questions that came in rapid, breathless bursts. Where had he been? What did he do? Why did he leave? Dean answered some and deferred others, drawing boundaries around the parts of his life that a 12-year-old should not know, while offering enough truth to honor her intelligence. He told her about the road, about the desert, about the men he rode with. He told her about a little girl in Arizona who had taught him something important. "What did she teach you?" Chloe asked. Dean paused, choosing his words with a care he had never applied to language before. "She taught me that being scared isn't a reason to do nothing. She taught me that the people who love you deserve more than money in the mail. They deserve you." When it was time to leave, Chloe walked him to the porch. She stood on the top step, and Dean stood on the walkway below, and for the first time in the visit, the gap between them felt manageable rather than infinite. "Will you come back?" Chloe asked, and the question carried the weight of every unanswered phone call, every missed birthday, every night she had listened for the sound of a motorcycle engine that never came. "Every week," Dean said, "if your mom says it's okay. And if it's not every week, it'll be every other week. And if I can't come in person, I'll call. And if I can't call, I'll write. But I will never disappear again, Chloe. That's the only promise I have the right to make. And I'm making it." Chloe nodded. She didn't fully believe him. 5 years of absence had taught her not to trust promises from this particular source. But there was something in his eyes, a rawness of vulnerability that she had never seen before that told her this time might be different. She would test it. She would wait and watch and measure his words against his actions, the way children always do with adults who have failed them. And either the promise would hold or it would break, and she would deal with the wreckage either way, because she was 12 years old and already tougher than she knew. Dean mounted his bike. He sat for a moment looking at the house, at the warm light spilling from the kitchen window, at the silhouette of his daughter standing on the porch. Then he started the engine, and the deep rumble of the V-twin filled the quiet suburban street, drawing curtains open and dogs to windows all down the block. He did not ride hard. He did not twist the throttle and disappear in a roar of chrome and defiance the way he had left 1,000 times before. He rode slowly, carefully, like a man who had finally realized that the destination mattered more than the speed. He took the highway toward Fort Worth, toward the clubhouse, toward the complicated, dangerous, deeply flawed life he had chosen. But the compass in his chest had been recalibrated, its needle pointing toward a 2-story brick house in North Dallas, where a 12-year-old girl stood on the porch watching the taillight of her father's motorcycle until it disappeared around the corner. The road would always be there. The club would always demand his blood and his loyalty. But the $10 bill that a 7-year-old girl had pushed across a diner table in a forgotten Arizona town had done something that 20 years on the road could not undo. It had cracked the iron shell around a man's heart and let the light pour through. In a small apartment in Oregon, a little girl slept peacefully while the rain whispered against her window. On her nightstand, beside a stack of library books, and a one-eyed bear wearing a flag pin, a crumpled $10 bill sat preserved behind glass in a cheap wooden frame. A monument, a memory. Proof that sometimes grace arrives not in the form you expect, not polished and proper, and dressed in white, but scarred and leather-clad, and roaring out of the desert on 2 wheels carrying the weight of its own broken past, answering the only prayer that ever truly mattered. The prayer of a child who refused to stop believing that someone somewhere would come.